various administrative support for that. But in the past, this blue logo was one that was created by students about the time that some of the data that I'm going to show you was collected. So 2008, 2009, 2010, and then the yellow and blue yoga logos with the child reading with the parent is they came a little bit later. The yellow and blue colors are an echo of the national colors of Rwanda. All right. So, what is Books and Beyond? I mentioned we're a university student organization. Uh, we had an international literacy partnership with a school in Rwanda up until about 2020. A lot of things happened in 2020 that led to us not being able to continue in the same way that we were. When it started, it was part of a living learning center, which is a residential center that you can find at universities in the States where students come together and share they share common interests. And so this particular living learning center, which was called the Global Village Living Learning Center, was for students who are interested in language learning and international studies and so forth. So they shared a wide variety of majors. Part of the mission of the Living Learning Center was to create a project that would bring students together um, around their shared interests and help them to engage in co-curricular activities that would deepen their learning and kind of provide a base for them. And so that's how the Books and Beyond project was born. There were IU alumni who were involved, who had contacts in Rwanda. There were people, they also had contacts with schools, with the original local schools or US schools were in New Jersey. So there was a middle school and a high school that was involved. Later, there were schools in Bloomington that were involved as well in helping to create stories. But the idea came from middle school students in New Jersey who said, we want to do something to help kids in Rwanda, and this is what we think we can do. Kids in Rwanda don't have a lot of books in their homes, and maybe we could share stories with them and they could share stories with us and we could publish them. Okay. So a lot of people got on board. When I first arrived, I was approached by people who were already involved, and they said, you have a background in Rwanda. I was just finishing up a postdoc, and you're interested in literacy, and so would you come and join us? So the uh, anthology that was published was called The World is Our Home. They ended up with 12 volumes. Most of them are available on IU ScholarWorks journals, so you can download the stories. You can look. A lot of them are bilingual in English and Kinyarwanda. You can see that some of them were written by groups of students or with an IU student mentoring a younger writer. The teachers in Rwanda were involved in translating things. And so it was a really big group effort. As you can imagine, here's some examples of illustrations that were created by the students on the sides, some photographs, and then also some examples of the covers that were published. So lots of really good work, really exciting work, and it was done together by groups of students. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how that happened. But first, I want to say, why did I choose to do a design case? I had a lot of data from the first 2 years of the project. That was actually the intention was to track the development of the project over 2 years. As it turned out, I became and still am the uh, archivist for the project. So when the Living Learning Center eventually shut down, the university closed it. The director at the time approached me, or the assistant director, and said, "There's a lot of stuff here from Books and Beyond. You want to come get it?" And so Um, so I've been sorting through things and giving them to the archive. So the IU archive is interested in collecting the materials about this project, but that material goes all the way up to 2020. And then, of course, we have material um, that continues on. So, but I wanted to look at this design as it's kind of an evolving system. I'm very interested in something called victory narratives, which is a concept that focuses on how we often talk about things in a way that we show that there are how they're already developed. We talk about them as something that has already been created, where we don't talk about the warts and the bubbles and the mistakes and the things that don't go the way that we expect. The decisions that we make over time as we adapt to feedback from stakeholders like teachers and parents and students, adapting especially to differences in the cultural context between Rwanda and the United States. And as it turns out, that kind of flexibility is really one of the strengths. It's really a core strength of the project, and so it makes sense to talk about it as a design case. Okay. So a little bit about the mission and values. So what you have on this slide here, on the under mission and values, those are my summaries of the the values that emerged from the design case. What you have in the blue slide is something that the students created for themselves in 2018, where they summarize what how they see books and beyond. So this slide was probably made as a for recruiting or else for getting a student grant. Um, so cross-cultural literacy exchange was very important. The students were sharing stories. Um, the Rwandan students wrote stories about their lives. The US students wrote stories about their lives, and they shared them. Um, one of the big emphasis was reciprocity among all the partners. We would have sessions, especially here in the Living Learning Center, where students would get together and talk about their concerns. In Rwanda, there were sessions that happened with teachers as well, and occasionally with students where we would ask for their feedback and their comments. I was involved in an interview project for a couple of years with graduate students where we would interview students individually and ask them about their reading preferences and also about what they thought about the project. Um, a very strong focus on experiential learning, also a strong focus on students as leaders. And this is something that the students identified as well, right? That they wanted this was a literacy leadership project. So they were learning about leadership through focusing on these literacy projects. Um, and that is a source of tension in the design. It's a source of good tension, though, I think. Okay. They do talk about addressing the book famine as one of their goals. We no longer talk about a book famine because that evokes certain images that we don't think are really appropriate. But there is nevertheless the actual situation is that most children don't have books in their homes, right? They don't, or they have very few books in their homes. So we would ask students, if you want to read a book, what do you do, right? And there's no bookstore in their own hometown. There's no library. The school, when we first arrived, did not have a library. And if you wanted to get a book, you'd have to take a bus ride into town, about a half an hour. And even there, they didn't really have a bookstore. So people were just buying curriculum, textbooks for their students, their children, or also dictionaries. So um, the fact that every child got a copy of The World is Our Home, every year these books were distributed to the kids, and was a really significant step for the kids, and many of the children Even now, sometimes they'll reach out to me and they'll say, "These are the books that we have in our home," right? Like I brought home books, and then when I went off to high school, my siblings brought home books each year from the Books and Beyond project, and these are the books that we have, and we all share them. So one book going to a home isn't just for one child; it's for every child in the home because they share. This is an annual project timeline that was taken from a handbook that was written in like 2011. And so it does reflect um, how the project eventually developed. And so we traveled to Rwanda the first year, but the books were printed in the United States and we carried them in our luggage. And then we were able to find places in Rwanda and sometimes also in Nairobi in Kenya to um, to prepare the stories. But effectively, the students wrote their books or their stories in the fall. In Rwanda, they wrote them in their classes. In the States, they wrote them extracurricularly with IU mentors, right? The collaborators, we'll talk about them a little bit more. Instead of calling them editors, we called them, or they called them collaborators because they had a broader scope to their activities. And winter and spring, there was a great deal of focus on editing the stories, preparing the stories. The students they laid things out, they proofed them, they raised funds to print, and then in the summer, a group of students would travel to Rwanda. And then beginning in 2012, you can see under step three, the Rwandan Parents Association at the school asked if we could run a 2-week English camp in July, usually, to help the kids to transition to English. So, beginning about 2009, Rwanda adopted English as the language of instruction. So the parents felt that the kids could benefit from having some more input on their English. And so that camp was co-run by volunteers from the United States and then also Rwandan partners, teachers, and so forth. And that did eventually become a curricular activity. It was a study abroad class where they prepared in the spring and early summer, and then they traveled together. And that would still be going on today if it weren't for 2020. So, how the work was organized, there were multiple teams. I've already mentioned the collaborators. The writing partners were the IU students who partnered with mainly with students here in the States to help them to develop their stories. The documentation team took videos, they interviewed people on video, they took photos. Evaluation team, they would do surveys and so forth to kind of test and see how students were doing. The pen pals, this was really creative. They paired individual IU students with teachers at the school in Rwanda to share letters. And we would take the letters, in a package and then distribute them. But the idea was to really hear directly from the teachers about what what they needed and and what they thought of the project. And also just to develop those connections with each other. And finally, the Rwandan culture and language team, their focus was to help students at the Living Learning Center and also on the broader campus to learn about Kinyarwanda. They would organize movie viewings and various activities to raise awareness. And this helped a great deal with the collaborators. So here's one of their slides. So the collaborators were involved in editing, but they were also involved in cultural literacy. So it was their job to learn about Rwandan culture and help the writing partners mentor their students, excuse me, so that the stories were culturally appropriate, that people were understanding Rwandan culture enough so that they weren't just completely missing the point with the stories that they wrote. So they promoted teamwork, they supported the writing partners, and they also learned from what the Rwandan culture and language team was involved with. So I can give you a good example. When the first time we brought home stories um, in 2009, I returned. We went in the summer and we had the first round of books, and then in October of 2009, I traveled back to Rwanda. And when I came home, I brought with me the first stories that the Rwandan kids had written. And we sat down with the editors, the collaborators, to look at those stories. And uh, there were concerns about content that they considered to be either culturally inappropriate for students, like young children, or that they just didn't understand it all. Um, And so one of the things that we were able to organize was a viewing of a movie called Munyurangabo, which was fairly new at that time and had examples of cultural storytelling, of epic poetry, and just everyday life in a Rwandan village, but also tensions between the various parties of the genocide and the war. And so so we were able to have conversations. And one of the ethics that came out of that was very powerful in the project was that students who wrote stories, children who wrote their stories, deserve to have their stories um, not untouched, but not severely edited, right? Like we didn't want to edit stories to the point where they were not really recognizable to this children anymore, just because we were concerned about the level of violence, right? Some of the students made very astute connections to like Aesop's fables or the original versions of the Grimm's fairy tales, which were collected in Germany um, from oral storytelling traditions there. You know, if the monster eats the child because she was disobedient to her parents, we're not going to take that out, right? Just because we think now children should not have those kinds of stories in things that they read. So some of these conversations happened because the collaborators had a broader scope for what they were doing. They weren't just editing the stories. They were working in partnership and teamwork with the writing partners and then also with the Rwandan culture team as they developed. So this is a lot to take in. The theoretical frameworks that inform this project included an emphasis on co-curricular experiential learning, expansive learning that comes from Engstrom and is sort of an offshoot of that is also communities of practice and Leib and Wenger, but it's this idea that, you know, that what we're doing is flexible. The project is always evolving. We're bringing in the things that we need to address the problems that we see. We're making changes and so forth. And so the project was always, you know, evolving in that way. Um, and then high impact practices. This was developed by an emeritus at IU, George Koo. High impact practices include things like common intellectual experiences. Um, and this is definitely one of the things that happened because of this project, this common intellectual experience of developing this activity, reflecting on it, discussing it, creating this team-based structure, doing it all mostly in a non-credit co-curricular process. Um, and including the intercultural component was very powerful for the students and powerful really for everybody who was involved. So here are some of the design challenges. Maintaining ideological coherence. The students came from all over campus. There were business majors, public affairs, folklore, anthropology. Um, and I could see, early on for me, coming from education, I had, pretty definite ideas about how I do things. And that's true of all of us. We have our academic, our disciplinary focuses. And I think one of the strengths of the project is that those teams, the collaboration team, the writing partners, the pen pals, eventually there was a public relations team, fundraising, which was different from the grant writing team. It gave a scope for everybody to be involved in ways that contributed to their goals and to their interests. So some people said, I really want to mentor a student. Okay, you can mentor a student. Other people said, I really want to learn more about Rwanda. Okay, you can be on the culture team, and maybe you should go to Rwanda in the summer because when you come back, you're going to be able to better teach people, right? You'll be a better influence in the group, sort of sharing your knowledge and so forth. And, that's really powerful. There were always tensions around, are we a charity? Are we doing this reciprocally? Um, One of the best praises that I think the project received was from the director of study abroad here, who said, a lot of study abroad is focused around going and learning, right? And you meet local people, you go to lectures or museums or go sightseeing, take a few classes, enjoy the local culture and so forth. That's very different from going and working reciprocally with people. So, when we were there, we spent 3 days training. Before the camp started, there were 3 days of training with the Rwandan teachers who were hired to help to run the English camp. And so they were training together with our students. And This is an extremely powerful learning experience. So it wasn't just, oh, we're here and we're giving you books and we hope you're grateful, right? It was, we're going to work together with you to achieve this project. And so everybody contributed on the basis of their abilities, and then everybody received something in return. Um, and the students, but they still wanted to, like they had these conversations here every year. Do the Rwandans really want us to do this? Right? Is this just saviorism? All right. Uh, how can we increase ways for people to participate in ways that are powerful and meaningful for them? But this is also, contributing to a project that has this coherence around our mission and what we hope to achieve. Mission drift was an issue at some times. There were very good new initiatives that came about because of partnerships with faculty here. Every one of these, like the reading rooms, the playgrounds, the eye clinics, the 3D printing of prosthetics, these came about because there were people here at IU who wanted to be involved and they brought their own expertise. In some cases, they brought their own graduate students. Definitely, the eye clinic was a activity where some of the faculty in optometry came with students and they set up eye clinics and so forth. And so a lot of benefits, but it also contributed to kind of blurring the focus. And this required boundary work. So if you think about literacy, um, I mean, even now people talk about how there's kind of a blurring of what literacy means when people talk about, oh, we need financial literacy or we need computer literacy. And if you start to think really broadly about literacy, you end up with, oh, everything's about literacy, right? Everything's a text, everything's about literacy. So we want children to have things to read, so let's build reading rooms. They need to have playgrounds in order to, have a place where they can play during their recesses And then they'll be better readers when they come in the classroom. Eye clinics are connected to reading. You need to have good reading, you need to be able to see well in order to read. Um, so all very powerful, very beneficial, but also requiring additional conversations and boundary work. Basically, like if you're going to have an organization, you need to have a sort of a bounded focus on who you are and what you're going to do. This one, Design Challenge 3 was most personal to me. So, in a student-led project with a student-led evaluation team, um, students would come and go, right? Like the maximum amount of time that a student might stay would be 4 years, but most students, um, were involved in the project for 2 or 3 years, and they might change teams. So every year these teams were reconstituted. Every year, the new evaluation team would redesign the evaluation. They would say, okay, this year we're gonna have group conversations and we're not gonna do a survey, which meant that there was limited longitudinal data. So, and I was asked to specifically mentor the evaluation team. Excuse me. Um, so the trade-off for me was student agency versus consistency. And I was not comfortable with saying, okay, because I'm the mentor for this group, this is how things are going to go, and this is, you need to create a survey and use it. I did create a survey, right? But the students made the decisions about what was going to be used and how they were going to do it. So that meant that we don't have a lot of longitudinal data that was collected by students. We do have some very good data about their experiences in doing uh, participatory youth evaluation and so forth. So there's a lot of interesting material, but there's nothing really that's effectively longitudinal. So a little bit more about the intercultural design. The students so I was involved in this a great deal, and also James Kigamwa. He is James Chamada Kigamwa is a former student of our program who's from Kenya. So we designed with the students some guidelines that they did adopt and use longitudinally for focusing on cultural and linguistic fit. Um, and I'll show you some of the things that they created on the basis of our input and then continued to use. So there on the in the white box you can see there were some guidelines for writing stories. Um, and these are some pretty basic things, but every year the students would teach the new group. So the students in Rwanda, their proficiency in English was developing. So, we want to limit passive verbs, stick to simple present, simple past, um, you limit the use of slang, um, limit the use of things like there is or there was. Can you say it in more simple, shorter terms? And these are good lessons for our writers here. And then the cultural checklist is on the next page. And I mean, I just think this is really, really powerful. Thinking about a simple storyline, checking for stereotypes, checking for portrayal of gender, and also diversity of students who are portrayed. Excuse me. Are you being honest about yourself? Are you being honest about your society and the way that you portray yourself? Um, what kind of conflict? This is a basic storyline question. Avoid using standard or non-standard language. In Rwanda, often number 7 was a point, so sometimes the stories had a religious focus. Okay, so maintaining being respectful, not trying to proselytize, um, staying within the target age, using inclusive illustrations and photographs. And then thinking about concepts that might be common to you, but not necessarily familiar to the students on the other side of the world. So, recycling was one that came up. Recycling is a common practice in a lot of neighborhoods here in the United States. In Rwanda, it looks a little different. In one, people don't use as much disposable packaging, right? And second, the recycling that does happen looks very different. So they might not have a recycling bin in their home. So, ultimately, if I just go back one again, having these this focus on cultural and linguistic fit was with really powerful learning opportunities for students and participants at all levels. So, a little bit about what we produced and our outcomes. Um, 12 bilingual story collections, over 24,000 books distributed. Most of them are available still online. Um, Leadership, collaboration, intercultural skills. Many students, as particularly IU students, reported that they learned more. The learning that they achieved was deeper than what they achieved in many of their courses. Many of the Rwandan participants experienced promotions, excuse me, success in schooling. I do have data that the school provided with to me of improvements in national exam scores. So the students there take a national exam in at the end of their sixth grade, which determines where they go to high school. And so at least anecdotally, the administrators and the teachers there really felt that they were seeing improvements. But anecdotally, also what we saw is that a lot of the participants who were teachers were able to go on and get more education and also receive promotions in their own trajectories. And so that was a good thing to see. And definitely that sort of thing happened here as well. Some implications. Uh, Student-led designs need strong scaffolding. I don't think that the project would have been as powerful without the support of the administrators at the Living Learning Center, administrators beyond the Living Learning Center, and then also the faculty who were involved. The flexibility to explore and adjust course and ask questions and building that into the project enables the kind of expansive learning that we really value. Evaluation infrastructure matters early, and I think that we're taking some of those lessons to heart now. And then finally, complexity is not a failure. So even though we know we continued to have questions and issues about the boundaries of the project and what should be included and who we should be partnering with and so forth. It's not a failure. It's all part of the design, and people benefited from those things, and everybody learned from the process as well. All right, so I'm going to stop, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about who we are now. So, Books and Beyond no longer travels to Rwanda. Part of the reason for that is that um, things have changed a great deal here since the pandemic. Um, there is an interest in study abroad, but the interest is different now. Uh, the way I put it is, when we went to Rwanda, we lived in we lived in a local house, and then it was kind of crowded. And then we went to this school every day, and we were in classrooms with 30 students. And there at that time there were no hand washing facilities at the school. And so, you're surrounded by kids, right? And people find that this like students are interested in a different kind of study abroad experience now. So now for lack of trying, but we're not doing study abroad at this point in Rwanda. But during the period where we really couldn't travel, the students, we kept meeting and we were talking about, how can we be involved? What are ways that we can continue the vision of Books and Beyond, but just maybe do it differently? And out of that came the Multilingual Minds Initiative, which is open to everybody. It's open to the public. It's open to people from other campuses. Um, and at this point, we're, talking about what are other people doing? How can we increase the supply of reading materials in languages around the world that are underserved? So they might be minoritized languages or indigenous languages, heritage languages, but they don't have enough materials for kids to learn how to read in their own language. We do know from literacy studies that children who can learn to read in the language that's most familiar to them go on eventually to be more successful in their schooling when they transition to English or whatever language it might be. So you can subscribe to our list. You can email us. We have our own email address. We have a current project which is funded by the Community Engaged Alliance here in Indiana to work with Yoruba and Burmese communities. So these are two significant communities of Nigerian Americans and Burmese Americans who are interested in supporting their heritage language and creating stories. So that's us. That's Books and Beyond, and I'd love to hear your questions, comments, and so forth. I apologize for going over time a little bit. Um, I'll just leave the screen up there for now. Any questions?
Yeah, sorry, Prof. This is Ugonna.
Hi, Ugonna.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. Um, there was something you said, I did not really get it. You when you said when you mentioned about not um editing the the stories written by the kids, you said something
Mm-hmm.
about was it a story that had a portion where the kid wrote that the monster ate the child because the child didn't
Mm-hmm.
listen to the parent?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
was wondering whether you meant that the child, it was advised for the portion to be removed or retained, because I wasn't really sure what you said.
Yeah, I'm happy to explain. And actually, I have a paper under review right now about this very situation. The IU students who were the collaborators received the stories and they read them together, like they were sitting around in a group reviewing the stories, and some of them said, "Oh my God, we can't have this in a children's book." And um they were getting ready to go on break. They were taking the stories with them to go on break and they were going to, spend more time with them. And so when they came back, we had additional conversations. And early on, some of the other participants, some of the other collaborators said, "Well, this is kind of like Grimm's fairy tales, and we don't really want to edit these stories to the point where they're unrecognizable." And the Rwandan teachers, because I'd already had a conversation with the Rwandan teachers about these very stories before we brought them back to the States. I said, I know that the Indiana students, some of the students in Indiana are going to object. And they said, you can't change them. this is part of the storytelling culture here. This is part of their culture, their experience, and it would be unfair to the students, to the Rwandan students, if the stories were really severely changed. But it was a process with the collaborators here. So they read, excuse me, they watched when you were in Gabo, the Rwandan film. James Kigamwa came in and discussed the film with them. And it was a really powerful experience of deepening intercultural understanding. Like you can't have just a surface understanding of the culture of the Rwandan school, the Rwandan kids and their homes and their families, the cultural experiences of those families, um, and then turn around and say, okay, but this story is not acceptable. So I'm happy to share the story with you. We're gonna
Yeah,
it is
yes.
yeah.
We have a similar kind of what would you call it? I don't know, a similar cultural thing in Igbo land.
Mm-hmm.
We have a
Mm-hmm.
similar story where a child I actually used the story in uh, one of the symposiums here that I presented at,
Yeah.
and the question was asked, whether it was safe to have kids, understand the culture that way. I had to explain to them that that's the culture. You don't understand it. You don't take it literally. It has a meaning.
Yeah.
The meaning is that you listen to your parents. You trust that your parents mean very well for you, and when they
Mm-hmm.
make decisions for you, it is for it's always for good intentions, even when it turns out not so well.
Yeah.
And so, but it is
Yeah.
culturally accepted.
Yeah.
And so, editing the story and removing that aspect of the story is not actually presenting the culture the way it should be presented. And so that was why
Absolutely.
I was really interested in what the decision was, because we have a
Yeah.
similar story and cultural understanding in Igbo land.
The decision was to not edit it.
Yeah, I'm happy for that.
Yeah. But then, I mean, at that time I was doing the ethnographic observation, and so um the collaborators near the end of the project in the spring when the stories were laid out, they taped them to the walls. They used like blue painter's tape, and they taped all of the stories to the walls of the lounge in the Living Learning Center. And was just for them. This is just for their residents. And they invited people to come in and help proofread, right? And so during some of the editing sessions where people going around and reading the stories, you could hear um, residents who were part of the project. So maybe they were just a pen pal, but they said, okay, I'll come in and help for a little bit. They pick up a pencil and they'd read that story and they go, oh, what is this? And there'd be a collaborator standing there who'd say, oh, well, that's part of the culture. We decided that we weren't going to change that. And so there was this informal learning going on that was about intercultural understanding that was on a very powerful level. And it was peer taught, right? So some of us like Chamwada and I and the assistant director, we were involved early on in sort of guiding things and saying, you really can't, you really can't make a change, and these are the reasons. Let's explore the reasons why, right? But then that learning became theirs. It was powerful, and then they passed it on to each other. And so in subsequent years, we didn't have as much trouble with people wanting to like really change stories. There were also some really interesting conversations, Ugonna, about not violence, but just stories that they didn't get. Like they're like, I don't understand it. And and we know, those of us who have deep intercultural experience that like jokes are hard to understand interculturally.
Yes.
Yeah, simple stories. that have really, really deep meaning, really rich meaning, are difficult to understand. Um, and so some of those also appear, they appear in the book. And the collaborators, they had conversations with people in the Rwandan culture team. So the culture team didn't come into being the first year. It sort of developed as a response to the need, right? Like, we need to understand this culture better. We need to find people in the community in Bloomington who can help us understand this, so that we're not just kind of making it into our own image, and it just reflects what we think is appropriate. Because understandings about what is appropriate for children, what is childhood even, is cultural. It's very, very culturally directed. So, okay, Umida, you have your hand up.
Okay, thank you so much for
Yeah.
such a great presentation. I learned a lot, especially new words like saviorism. I never heard that
Yeah.
before. So, my question was at the beginning, students wrote stories in English, and
Mhm.
then, if I'm not mistaken, they switched to Kenya, Rwanda, and the books became bilingual, which is great.
Mhm.
So, uh, why this decision was making, or just can you reflect on that part a little bit more?
Yeah, the first year the book was entirely in English. So, the project was, it was started in the States, and the students at the university, they were wanted to get started with this, and then they were partnering with the school in New Jersey with the young students. And so everything was in English. They printed those books, they put them in their bags, and they took them to Rwanda, and then they started having conversations with the teachers there and with the students and so forth, and there were listening sessions. Um, so the early motivation was, the school said, the headmaster, the parents association, they said our kids need to learn English. I mean, this was a really powerful felt need because the language of instruction had been French. Okay. And so they had to transition to English. And then in conversations with the Rwandan partners, but also students here at IU, they said, we're not comfortable with just doing this in English. I mean, this needs to be also reflecting their own language. So the the current policy is that in Rwanda, the kids start school and they learn how to read in Kinyarwanda. And then after third grade, they transition to English. And then they learn how, they have to do everything in English. Um, and that process um has a lot of wastage. And I'm not using that term, it's not just my own term. This is a term that's used in development circles, that there are kids who just can't make that transition. And so they're not really that successful at school. So it takes more than 3 years to become a proficient reader of Kinyarwanda, and then transitioning to a language that you don't hear people speaking very much, because everybody speaks Kinyarwanda in your home environment, and so forth. So you only really, you're learning this language at school, English. They just wanted to have more support for the Kinyarwanda speakers. Um, and the book was designed too, so that when you open the front page, when you get to the first stories, those are beginner stories. So they're number stories or alphabet stories or like picture books. There's I showed you, it probably went by pretty quickly. I can go back um, to the images. There we go. This one in the corner here, the bird is blue. That was from an early story. So it was a beginner story. And then as you progress through the book, the stories gradually became more difficult. And so we wanted the kids to have early exposure to English, like the bird is blue, okay? Um, but we also wanted to support the development of their Kinyarwanda reading proficiency as well. And many of the stories that the Rwandan kids wrote in their classes, and then later they wrote in the English camp, they wrote, they would write them in Kinyarwanda, and then their teachers would help them to translate them into English. So they were always more proficient at Kinyarwanda than they were at English. So that's kind of a rambling response to your question, Umida.
No, it
I
was
hope that
great.
helps.
It
Yeah.
was great. So, I'm also interested a little bit more on Saturday trainings that were organized for students here at Global Village.
Hmm.
Uh, I know that village. I don't know if it still exists,
It
but
does not. It does not.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah, it was a great place to learn intercultural communication and cultures.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so how did that work? I mean, you already talked about it, but uh,
Well,
I just want to know more details.
are you talking about the writing mentors?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, the writing partners who were mentoring the young writers. They would, and this was US students. They didn't meet online with the Rwandan students, and there are many reasons for that that I can get into. But they would they would get together and everybody would get online. So like the students at the school in New Jersey, they would come to school. There'd be a teacher there, and everybody get a computer and they'd sit down and they'd connect with their writing mentor. And they might, sometimes we talked, there were some sessions where we had some front loading of like a little bit of a lesson about story design or about storyboarding or something like that. But then the writing mentors would just sit and work with their mentees on idea generation and creating the story and editing the story and thinking about how are we going to illustrate it. Okay. Do we need some pictures? What kind of pictures do we need? And then to make it, to really sort of solidify that relationship, they also did an early trip. So where the IU students traveled to the school, um, and spent a weekend working on stories with the students. And then the um, the New Jersey students also came to IU. Trying to remember how it worked. I think the New Jersey students came in the fall to IU and they lived in the dorm for the weekend. They stayed with their mentors in their rooms. And of course, they did a lot more than just story development. They did relationship building and they explored the campus. Part of the goal of the teachers at the New Jersey school was to encourage students to think about going to college, and also to think about going to IU. Um, and then in the spring, when this it was around late January or early February, they would get a bus, and all of the IU students would travel to New Jersey and sleep at the school. And there was always some fun activities that they would organize, and because they were close to Manhattan, and so I remember going ice skating at one of the parks in Manhattan and so forth. But it was relationship building. This was more than just mentoring a student to write a story. This is sort of mentoring a student in life is a little bit like big brother, big sister programs that are common here in the States. So I hope that helps. Uh,
Thank you.
yeah. At that time, the school in Rwanda didn't even have electricity. So connectivity was the little connectivity that they had was only available to teachers. Later, they did get electricity. They did uh, have more computers for teachers. And I'm not sure where they're at right now with connectivity and devices for students. There was some interest on the part of some people who were involved in the project here in the States who said, "Oh, let's get some donors and give everybody a device, right? Like that'll help." And you know, so then we had conversations about sustainable technology and appropriate technology and um, uh, the ramifications of that kind of decision. Um, yeah, I mean, it people generated a lot of ideas, and there were a lot of conversations about what can we do um, and how can we set things up to improve, to respond to the requests of the school. So the teachers really wanted bicycles because they said we're walking. In some cases, we have to walk 2 hours each way to get to school. And and there was a lot of interest in the Living Learning Center in raising funds to buy bicycles for the teachers. And they did it. They some of the Greek organizations that students were affiliated with had fundraisers on campus. There was a fundraiser where they set up a stationary bike and they had a bike to Rwanda, bike around the world, and people would volunteer to get on the bike and keep it going, measuring the miles that it was, hypothetically traveling. And they raised the funds to buy bikes in Rwanda to give to those teachers. Um, so there were a lot of creative responses, creative activities that came out of that kind of met the needs of on both sides. So the students here needed to feel like they were involved and they were contributing. Um, Greek organizations or students who are in the School of Business might have a different perspective on how they want to go about doing that than, say, students in the School of Education. And the project was flexible enough to kind of allow for a lot of that. And I think that was really powerful. So, do we have time for another question, or are we? It's 11 o'clock now, so I think that out of respect for your time and today's Saturday and it's kind of a busy day, I just want to say thank you to everybody who joined us. I'm happy to stay on and discuss or answer questions with anybody who would like to do so. But thank you, and I'm just going to go back to that last slide and finish with that. If you want to stay in touch with us, you are very welcome.
Thank you, Beth, and have a great weekend.